Good morning, U.S. history students. Today we're going to be taking notes 3.2 about the Great Depression. Your essential question: what was the Great Depression and how did it impact the United States? So, the Great Depression started when the stock market crashed in October of 1929. Remember the 20s, we had the roaring 20s. Things were going pretty well in the United States. We had just finished up World War I, and some people started to invest their money in the stock market. So, the stock market, what they were doing is they were buying shares of a company in order to make money, which is dividends. So, they would buy stocks when they were low, and once they were worth a lot more money, when they were high, they would sell them later. So whenever you buy stocks from a company, you're investing. You're investing your money, you're buying shares. A share is a part ownership of that company. As a shareholder, you get to share in the profits, but you also risk sharing in the losses of that company. So in the 20s, people were doing something called buying on the margin. They would put down about 10 to 50% of what the price was for the share, and they would have to pay that money back. So it was basically like a loan that they were using to buy stocks in the stock market. But by October of 1929, people started to notice that the stock prices were pretty overvalued. So on Black Tuesday, which was October 29th, 1929, people started panicking. Everyone went down and tried to rush to get rid of their stocks all at once. So instead of being able to sell their stocks, a lot of people were losing their stocks. In 15 days, investors lost over $30 billion. So people who did well, they were able to pay off their loans and earn a profit, but those that didn't do well, they still had to pay back the loan and the interest to be able to pay for the original stocks that they bought, and most of these stocks were now useless. A lot of people didn't have the money to do this. Stockbrokers and banks called in their loans. They asked people to pay their loans back, but people didn't have any money to pay them back. So the economy started struggling. People started closing factories, restaurants, banks were closing because they didn't have any more money to hand out to people. There were too many goods and not enough money to pay for them. When you loan your money from a bank, banks are actually loaning out the savings of other people. So banks couldn't collect their loans, so they couldn't give people back their savings that they had invested in the bank to begin with. 9 million people lost their life savings in the United States during that time, and hundreds of banks closed across the United States. It's not like this anymore because we learned from the stock market crash. So once the 20s hit, the late 20s hit, and people started going through this depression, they started believing that it was the government's job to help people out. If people are struggling economically, they thought that there should be a safety net that the government provides them to help them out. Republican presidents did not agree with that. They were hostile to unions and hostile to strikes. They favor business over labor. So, this is still something that Republicans and Democrats fight about today. Republicans don't believe it's the job of government to help people out when they're struggling through economic times. And Democrats believe that we should pay taxes in order to take care of people when they need it. President Hoover was the president during this time. He kept arguing that the economy is going to recover, things are going to bounce back, everyone's going to be okay, but it turned out to be sort of a too little, too late policy once he actually got involved. So it didn't actually turn around on its own. The economy did not recover, it didn't bounce back. He tried to start implementing policies, but he failed. The Depression got much worse, and people started blaming President Hoover for the Depression. So as you can see, banks were closed, people lost their jobs, people started creating their own homes in these areas called Hoovervilles, that's what they would call them. They would use any materials that they had to build a home. So people would use tar paper, cardboard, scrap materials. These shelters of the homeless came to be called Hoovervilles because they were mocking President Hoover. New York City had about 15,000 homeless people at this time. And in the 1930s, the United States experienced the Dust Bowl. So, the Dust Bowl was a period of severe dust storms that went across the plains, the middle of the United States. This caused major ecological damage and agricultural damage to people who lived in the middle of the country in the 30s and the 40s. We would have these big black clouds of dust that would come over entire areas of town. They were known as a black blizzard. It was caused when the wind would pick up all of this dry dirt and blow it over. So you can see it's kind of similar to the smoky skies that we've seen recently. So this was caused by severe drought. So they didn't have rain. I don't know if you remember a few years ago in California, we were struggling through drought as well. We were trying to conserve water because we didn't have enough rain that was coming. They also had decades of extensive farming on the same land, growing the same things without crop rotation. So, without crop rotation, they weren't preventing any wind erosion and the nutrients were getting sucked out of the soil. So, the soil just became very dry. And that way, anytime a dust storm came, anytime wind blew up, it would cause a massive dust storm. So the Dust Bowl did affect over 100 million acres of Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas, so those states in the middle of the United States in the 1930s. So a lot of people picked up and they started moving westward. They decided that they were no longer going to be able to live there in the middle of the country. They couldn't grow anything on their lands anymore. So they started moving. So you can see all these people had to wear masks, just like we do today, because the air quality was so terrible during the Dust Bowl. So millions of acres became useless, and hundreds of thousands of people were forced to leave their homes, and they started migrating over to California. A lot of these people were called Okies, which was a derogatory name that people would use to refer to them when they started moving westward. As you can see, they first started moving west and moving into the southern form of California, but they had to start moving up because they didn't have a lot of jobs there as well. Over a million people ended up abandoning their homes. They faced discrimination once they came over to the new places. And this photo here is from Dorothea Lange. It's one of the most famous photos of that Dust Bowl time period. This mother and her children. But once they made it all the way to California, there were not many jobs. The wages were pretty low. They were struggling still to feed their families and take care of their families. So again, Dorothea Lange, the most famous photographer of the Depression era. She was taking pictures of people struggling through this time. This one's called Migrant Mother, excuse me. And this is Dorothea Lange here taking these pictures. All of these pictures were taken by her during the Great Depression. And further on, continuing into World War II. So unfortunately, Hoover believed in what we call trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics believes that if you want to improve the economy, you have to do it from the top. We have to start with our biggest businesses, help them out first, and then everything else will trickle down to the lowest workers at the bottom. So that means like giving tax breaks to big businesses, and that way they believe that they will create more jobs or they'll raise the pay for their workers and help out the lower classes eventually. In 1924, Congress authorized a bonus to all the soldiers that had served in World War I. So, this bonus was going to give them a bonus pay for each day that they served in the war. It was going to be $1.25 for each day that they served, about $400 a year, which was a lot of money back then. But it wasn't supposed to be paid until 1945. This was their way of encouraging men to join the war during World War I. By 1932, we had been struggling through the Depression for a couple years, and veterans believed that they should receive their bonuses as soon as possible. They couldn't wait until 1945. So they started a march. They started marching from the West Coast all the way to the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Once they got there, the House of Representatives agreed to give them the bonus, but the Senate voted against it. So a lot of people left, but thousands of veterans stayed. They created these camps here in Washington, D.C. After about a month, the police were ordered to clear them out, and then violence broke out. Then the army was called in to forcibly remove these protesters. These protesters were veterans that had previously served in the army. And this was pretty bad for President Hoover. You can see mistreating veterans, burning down their temporary housing outside. So by the end of 1932, Americans were ready for a change. We would have a new president come in, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. He was elected in 1932, and we would have him take office in 1933. And that's the end of your notes today, so don't forget to write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned.